Principle 3, the operations plan. Right, and here I want to try to avoid some confusion between, so we're talking about principles of the project, defines the sort of the project plan, all right? So there's 4 major components in the project plan. And I'm asking for a UAS project outline, right, for this next assignment. And so there's a little bit of a confusion I generate here, and I need to figure out a better way to sort of name these or to differentiate them. But the operations plan really talks specifically about, how the UAS is going to be used to actually perform the tasks it needs to do to accomplish the goal, the overall objectives that are defined in the project, right? So what you're doing for this project, for your UAS project, is you're developing a UAS project plan. Now the operations plan is only part of the overall plan, right? So to understand what's going to happen with the UAS project, we need all 4 components. So we need to understand what our objectives are with the project. We need to understand what our equipment is. Then we need to understand what we're doing, which essentially is the operations plan. And then we need to figure out how are we going to wrap up the project? How are we going to deliver what's needed for the client to feel satisfied with the work that we've rendered for whatever services or fees that we're collecting. All right, so what I'm talking about, the operations plan here, is an outline, because the operations plan is broken down into several elements that allow us to sort of have a good flow of operations, so that when it comes time to performing the mission, we have a very clear set of what we're going to accomplish and the order in which we're going to accomplish those things. Because I mentioned that when we're dealing with UAS projects, so we could spend a year or more preparing for the project, all right? We go out and we spend maybe a week collecting the data, flying the UAS, collecting the data for the project. Then we might spend a couple of months or more developing data products, doing analysis, working all that analysis into a report that we're going to present to the client. So while we spend 18 months on a UAS project, we might only spend 4, 5, 3 days flying the operations, all right? So the operations plan really is talking about that brief period of time where we're actually conducting the flights. Now the reason, so the reason it isn't, UAS project isn't typically stress isn't necessarily affiliated with the amount of time we're spending on each of these principles or each of these components of the overall plan, all right? What we want to do is we want to put time on our side. So we want to start planning as soon as possible so that we are spending a year planning, So the idea is it's not a stressful process. So when it comes time to conduct the actual missions, it's fairly stress-free. We know what to expect. We've rehearsed. We have all that information, all the information we need to be successful with the operations are in our mind. Where the stress should be, not that flying should be stressful, but it should at least heighten your awareness. So the flight is where we need to be on top of our game, right? We have time is on our side with the planning, time is on our side with the data analysis. Those are things we can set our own deadlines. we can give ourselves a couple months to work on the data side. What we may and what we probably are limited in is when we can actually do those flights, right? So the operations plan is really about the days that we're going to be in the field, either preparing to fly or actually have that UAS in the air conducting the UAS missions. All right, so the operations plan sort of lays out all that stuff. All right, so the UAS operations plan is a written centralized document that provides common guidance on virtually all decisions related to the project. And this is probably a statement that more directly talks to the project plan than the operations plan. So this is our action and contingency plan for any expected or unexpected events that are going to arise during flight, right? So this is what do I mean by unexpected? This is where the 2 is 1 and 1 is none scenario comes into play, right? This is where we can make assumptions that, hey, some things are going to fail, but if we have a good operations plan, we should be ready. We should be a little bit ready for the unexpected, right? So the idea here is that we're building in contingency so that we're maximizing the use of our most valuable asset, which tends to be the operators, all right? So our crew is going to be our most valuable, our most expensive asset when it comes down to UAS operations. So what we want to do with our operations plan is prepare contingencies so that our crew can stay busy and can stay effective regardless of what happens to our equipment. So the purpose of the plan is to provide a reference to anyone interested in understanding more about the many project elements necessary to successfully complete the UAS project. The main elements of the operation plan are laid out below. All right, and here's just a little note for you guys that are working for you guys developing your UAS project plan. Don't be undone by a reality that does not fit your plan. Keep yours succinct, flexible, imaginative, and pessimistic on the maintenance and risk management. So what I'm saying is, like, you guys have free will to sort of write in, you guys don't have to come up with the money. You have to come up with a budget and come up with a list of equipment, right? But you're not limited by the reality of, oh, geez, that drone, I really would like to use it, but it's very expensive, and I think it would be too expensive for this project. I mean, you guys are not bound by any reality in that aspect. So I would say make your plans flexible, use really good equipment, use really good redundancy, because you have that free will to do that right now. You don't have to come up with the money to make this plan very efficient or go on the cheap side because that's all the funds that you have. So make it flexible, and that's what I mean by be pessimistic. Assume things are going to fail, all right? So we want to build in some redundancy into our operations plan. Okay, so operations plan elements, by and large, this is just a guide for you guys, all right? So you guys can have other operations plan elements that go into your operations plan, and maybe some of these are not as relevant to some of you as others. And so let's look at what the plan elements are that I've made available to you guys and talk about when some of these aren't necessarily necessary. All right, so our flight execution scenarios. So here's where we really want to, so before I even say that, ultimately what I wish I had I wish I could just hand you an example of an operations plan, all right? And I am developing one for our for the 2040 class, for the operations class. That class, we're going to start flying outdoors on campus next week. So I'm developing the operations plan for that. And honestly, I just haven't had really a good one in the 3 semesters I've taught this class where we've been doing this project. This project has evolved a little bit each semester. And I just really haven't had a great operations plan from anyone that I can hand to you guys as an example. So I'm really hoping my messaging has been a little bit more focused, I think, this semester. So I'm really hoping you guys are going to be it. This is going to be the golden semester. So no pressure, but hoping you guys are going to deliver for me. So for the semesters to come, I'll have some examples that I can deliver to you guys. So I am in the works in developing an operations plan, and I'm sort of looking at that, the progress that I've made on that one, and seeing if there's anything useful to share with that. All right, so I'll have, and let me see, because there are definitely some things I'm gonna want you guys to put into this operations plan over the next couple weeks. All right, so we'll have 2 weeks from today. But let's go over what I have here, and then I'll provide a little more guidance maybe by the end of the day today. All right, so flight execution scenarios. So here's where really what I want you guys to do is to have a really good imagination about what you're going to accomplish with your UAS project. So again, the idea here is that we come up with an idea in our minds, we go to the internet, or we go to people we know that have executed this idea in the past, and we're gonna formulate an idea about how this type of project is executed. All right, so then we're gonna come back to what we know, what we've learned about UAS in this class. We're going to tie those two things together, and we're going to come up with an idea about how we're going to use what we already know and marry that with what we know about what people are doing to execute these particular projects. Right, and so this is where we're going to have, we're going to look at each of our objectives, and we're going to figure out how each of those objectives is going to be accomplished by a particular UAS and a particular flight with that UAS, all right? So this is where we want to think about, so how many flights, these are just some examples, so how many flights are going to be required to meet each objectives? What kind of hazards are we going to be looking for during these flights related to the particular mission? Are they going to be automated flights? So am I going to use some sort of ground control system to do automated flights? Or am I going to have a pilot on the sticks actually conducting the flights themselves? How long are each of these flights going to take? And then I can start figuring out, once I know like my length of either the distance I need to fly or the time I need to fly, now I can start figuring out my battery cycle. So how many batteries do I need to be continually flying? All right, so so this can be, you know, a single battery makes sense for some aircraft, like a DJI Mavic, for example, has a single battery. But so a DJI M600 actually has 6 batteries. So what we're talking about here is a battery cycle would be for the M600, that would be those 6 batteries. For the Mavic, that would be the 1 battery. So a little equation here. So we have charge time divided by flight time plus 1. And that's what we need for a single cycle. Right, so the idea here is that if we have a single battery, it takes 45 minutes to charge. It discharges in 15 minutes. Then I know if I want to fly continuously, I need at least 4 batteries. Okay, and the idea here, as soon as I land and that first battery is extinguished or is done, I can stick that on the charger. So by the time I'm through my 4th cycle, that first battery is fully charged and I can start over again. Now there are some complications with reality in that model, and that is typically we don't want to charge batteries when they're hot. So really what we usually need is an additional cycle to let batteries cool down to room temperature before we can actually stick them on the charger. So that's sort of where the +1 comes in, and it really depends on the system. Some systems will run pretty smooth, like typically a fixed wing UAS. Lots of times when we land, those batteries are not really warm. They will cool down pretty quick and can be put on the charger pretty fast. If we have a multi-rotor system, now typically when we land that multi-rotor system, those batteries are hot and might take a full flight to cool down. So just some things, these are the details that I would love for you guys to uncover in your research, right? So when you're looking at doing a particular project, if you're watching some YouTube videos on people doing those projects or interviews with pilots that have conducted the project, those are the details. Like that stuff is primo. That's the kind of thing where I would love for you guys to gain some that's the goal of this project, for you guys to gain those little nuggets of experience from not even touching a UAS, but from doing the research. That's where I'm trying to guide you into finding that stuff. Excuse me. So that's I'm looking at my my numbers are off a little bit. I'm looking at my operations plan. So there's going to be a location element, and I'll add that, and I'll talk about it. I'll talk about it next week. All right, and so we need to have a map. We need to have a map of our location that goes along with our flight execution scenarios. So we need to see where our project is, where these flights are going to be conducted. We're going to identify some things on the map. And I haven't added that to the outline here, but I will add it. And I'm going to be looking for those things before your final project plan. All right, so flight execution, because I really would like, well, it doesn't really matter what order this stuff ends up in, but so training and long-term planning. And so the reason this immediately follows flight execution scenarios is that, you know, what we might find when we're laying out, like, so what are the flights that we're going to need to execute this plan? What we may find is that, oh wow, that flight is really complicated, right? So we're going to fly in this canyon, and then we're actually going to have to use some beyond visual line of sight rules for the FAA, and we're going to have to use this new payload, which is going to require us to do this crazy flight pattern to activate the payload. And so I'm going to need some advanced training. My operators are going to need some advanced training to successfully execute this scenario. So that's why training and long-term planning are involved here. If I need to acquire a specialty payload, or if I need my operators to acquire a particular skill, we need that rolled into that that long-term operations plan, right? So that when it comes time, when the day comes to fly, that training is already part of the operator's psyche and can roll right into those effective flights. Okay, so I came up with this acronym WET. So weather, environment, and timing, and this might be a good location actually. This could be where a map, also could be where a map rolls into the study. So we want to know what's our study area size and required range. So, you know, maybe we have a 100-acre field that we're going to be targeting. We want to make a map of our grandpa's farm with his barn on there or something. So we want to know, you know, how big is the farm? How close can we get to the farm, right? Sometimes we can't directly access our target for UAS, and that's one of the benefits of having a UAS, is that we don't have to be right on the object that we're trying to image. We can be a little bit further away, launch, and send our aircraft over there to collect the imagery. So how far do we have to fly? What are the weather limitations that exist for our selected aircraft? You know, by and large, if we're collecting data, we typically don't want to be flying in extreme weather conditions. But, you know, for a search and rescue type project, that's where we really want to have an aircraft that's more resilient to weather. Right, so for example, the M210 or the M300, the DJI M300 or M210, those aircraft are built to fly like in rain, to operate in rain, to operate in winds that exceed 25 knots. Because typically our commercial off-the-shelf aircraft are, you know, by and large limited to about 25 knots of wind and will not operate in wetting. This is a term that DJI uses, wetting rain. What is wetting rain as opposed to a mist? You know, it's qualitative, but you know, a little rule of thumb that we use within Department of Interior is if you wouldn't have your laptop open in precipitation, then you wouldn't fly your drone either, right? So the idea there, if it's a little misty, you know, maybe you might subject your drone to a little bit of a mist, but if it's rain, you definitely don't want your laptop open, you know, so pretty intuitive parallel there. Okay, are there seasonal limitations to data collection and access? So this is a big thing with vegetation survey or wildlife survey, where our target is only going to be available at certain times of the year. Right, so these are things to identify. For example, we want to do Grandpa's farm, and Grandpa has beautiful flowering dogwood trees. We would love to have that in our three-dimensional model. So we know we want to fly between April and June because that's when the dogwoods are flowering. As an example, what are the daily limitations? So this is huge for image data collection. Typically, we like to fly on either end of the what we call solar noon. So the sun is peak at a certain time of day at a certain time of year. So typically we want the sun to be straight up so our shadows are minimized, right? And if we fly over 8 hours, an 8-hour day, what we'll see is the imagery we collected in the morning is quite a bit different than the imagery collected in the evening. where we could have shadows that are, you know, like this in the morning and then they're like this in the evening. Trying to make that imagery match up when we go to create a final product can be very tricky. So there are lots of temporal scales that we need to consider, particularly with a data collection scenario. And that's, you know, where we get to law enforcement and we get to first responder type stuff, fire, search and rescue. Those types of things were not necessarily limited. Our wet element for those type of scenarios are going to be very different from a data collection type scenario, where if we're doing search and rescue or we're doing some sort of first responder stuff, the only wet conditions we're looking at is like what's going to keep us from operating, what's going to keep us from getting in the air. Where if we're doing a data collection, we need to be a little more stringent about what sort of environmental conditions that we're willing to operate in. Travel and logistics, you know, I'm going to edit this right here. I'm going to strike out some of this because I don't want, where's my strike through? I don't want people worried about lodging and food. All right, and I'll talk a little bit about, we'll talk about this again next week because when we're dealing with any type of first responder emergency response UAS operations, we have to talk about mobilization. So there are two types of travel with emergency response, right? We have to travel to the site and then be available, right? And then a first response type UAS operation is we're on site, but we're not necessarily flying. Okay, we're only going to fly when the incident commander requests our presence. So the incident commander might call the UAS, call you out to be part of a UAS crew on a fire, for example. And what that means is that you are at the fire location. So, for example, I was mobilized to the Bighorn Fire in Tucson last year to be part of a UAS operation. So I bought my airfare, I traveled to Tucson, I stayed at a hotel, and that was where I was based. Now, when the incident commander requested the UAS to be operated for a particular day, then there's a second set of travel logistics. Then I have to coordinate with my UAS team. I have to figure out where we're going to fly from. I have to figure out what our flights for the day are going to look like. All right, so there's a mobilization, and then there's the response. So travel and logistics is going to be a little bit different depending on what your mission is. What I don't want you guys to get hung up on is trying to figure out what kind of budgeting I'm going to do for lodging and what kind of budgeting I'm going to do for food. People got to get a little bit hung up there, and I just want you guys to avoid thinking about those things. All right, airspace and policy. So we're going to talk a lot more about that next week. I think that's one of our last modules, sort of where I'm sort of spewing some information for you guys to gather. We're going to talk about policy, but basically we have we have sort of 3 levels of policy and airspace and policy that we need to consider. So we have regulations, right? So these are the laws, the things that we have to follow, right? So the FAA Part 107 rules, right? So these are regulations. These are things, if we don't follow these rules, we actually can be penalized by law, either through money, through monetary penalties or through jail time. We talked earlier in the semester, I presented that example of that pilot in Los Angeles that hit a LAPD helicopter, and he's going to jail. He's going to spend a few months in jail for violating FAA regulations, all right? Then we have policies. So these can be so internal. So let's say I work for Department of Interior. We have rules on top of the FAA's rules that I have to follow. You know, some of those things are, yeah, some of those are regulations I'm obligated to follow, but some of them are just like guidelines, right? So I typically wouldn't have someone who just got their certification, I typically wouldn't have them fly a mission, on their first time out. I'd probably make them go through a few missions as an observer before I had them be the remote pilot in charge, right? So these are just policies that I might have in place institutionally that help to keep us safe and to to sort of increase the odds of success for our UAS mission. Right, and then I'm going to have some project requirements. So for example, to fly on campus for AES 2040, I have to go through the rigmarole of getting campus policy, meeting all the requirements for flying the AHAC policies for flying UAS, right? So I had to fill out a little waiver about UAS flights, and I tried calling them directly because I'm like, well, the class doesn't really fit with your waiver form because it's talking about a specific pilot, and we're going to have 8 pilots. So the point is here that we're going to have some project-specific requirements. So either because of land ownership or because of airspace requirements of where the project is located, I have to be aware that there are going to be some project-specific requirements for airspace. And these are the things that you guys need to identify for your particular project. So what policy requirements must be followed for the UAS at the study area location under the parameters necessary to complete the project with the greatest chances of success? All right, so other things, what I mean here is, so maybe our target resolution for the particular sensor that we're using. So looking at, our specific objectives, identify a resolution of imagery that we want to have. And then in step 2, I identified the sensor that we're going to use that's going to give us, help us meet that objective. Well, to get that sensor to capture data at our target resolution, maybe I have to fly at 600 feet instead of FAA's mandated 399 feet, right? So to successfully achieve my goals for the project, now I have to go out and seek a waiver from the FAA to adequately conduct, the mission. So these are the type of things I'm hoping you guys will uncover. So safety and risk management, and I will go into a little bit of detail about what I'd like to see in your project outlines for risk management. We've talked a lot about risk management, and so you guys can go back and look at human factors if you want to think about what else gets thrown into this section. It's a very important section. Not only to feel good about making sure that, I don't take down a manned aircraft or I don't chop off my visual observer's fingers or something like that. But this is really important for the successful completion of the project. Yeah, not only do you not, you don't want to chop your visual observer's finger off because it would be bad for that person and maybe you like them or maybe you don't. But if you chop someone's finger off, you're done for the day. Your project is, you know, you're going to be grounded for the day while you're, at least for the day, while you try to figure out, well, why did this happen? How do we avoid this happening in the future? So keep in mind, risk management is a very important element of operations and getting the operations completed successfully. And then finally, we did have a question on the budget here. We started talking about the project outline. You know, have fun with this. Like I said, this will be the only, if you guys do pursue a career in UAS or any, you know, anything really, and you start, when you have to develop a budget as part of a project plan, you know, it's going to be grounded in reality, and you're going to be limited to what the reality is of finding the money and only being able to purchase things that are affordable to you. So have fun with the budget. You know, if you want to identify, you know, a source of funding, that's great. You know, that's a great place to use some of your energy to go out and find organizations that provide funding in support of UAS for your particular mission. That's great. Develop an overall, you know, income, and then what I want to see is that you're budgeting according to the equipment that you selected and according to the crew that you selected. And now that budget can include some long-term planning, so you know, sending pilots away to external training, or you know, budgeting time to go train with a particular fire department or something like that to understand how they operate. You know, don't limit your imagination here with how you're using your budgets.